So I get asked fairly frequently if you can use the full fur bomber hat pattern and video tutorial to sew the leather shell of the bomber hat. That's how it looks with the full fur. And the answer is yes, kind of, but you need to make some adjustments. The way the pattern is drafted for the full fur bomber hat, it's sewn together with a 0 seam allowance, which means that when you're done sewing, the edges of the fur pattern pieces are laying edge to edge. There's no seam allowance used. And that is, generally speaking, how you want to sew pieces together if you're sewing fur to fur, because that gives the smoothest finish when you're sewing with fur. When you're sewing leather, if you sew it with 0 seam allowance so that the edges lay edge to edge when you're done sewing, your raw edges of the leather will show, which is generally not what you want with leather. So if you're going to sew a leather shell on a fur sewing machine, then you would need to add an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on all of the pattern pieces, all of the leather pattern pieces, and I also recommend it for the fur pattern pieces, so that your raw edge of your leather doesn't show. This one I sewed using my leather sewing machine, and I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance everywhere where it's sewn leather to leather, and I added an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance everywhere where it's leather to fur. So if you look at this pattern piece, along the top edge there, which is there, it's sewn leather to leather, so I added a 1/4 inch. Along the bottom, it's sewn leather to fur, so I added an 1/8 of an inch there. And the shell, the leather parts, I sew on my walking foot leather sewing machine, and then I'll attach the fur pieces using the fur sewing machine. So the top, I added a 1/4 inch all the way around. This piece, again, 1/4 inch all the way around. The forehead flap, I add a 1/4 inch along the bottom of the leather piece and an 1/8 of an inch around the sides. And then with the fur piece, an 1/8 of an inch along the top and the bottom edge, and then an 1/8 of an inch all around the inner fur piece for that as well. And to get the top stitching look, you sew your seam as you normally would on the sewing machine, and then if I do a single row of top stitching like that, then I'll trim one of the seam allowances, fold the other one over, and then top stitch it down. And for the center line, where I do the double row of top stitching, I sew the seam together with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I lay the seam allowance on this side this way and on this side this way, and then stitch them both down one at a time. You don't need a double needle machine to get that look. You just sew them down one at a time. The same sort of thing can be done if you want wool on the outside of your hat, but then you need to add 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter of seam allowance, because wool needs a larger seam allowance because it's a woven material and it can become unraveled if you use too small of a seam allowance. So if you're a go-getter, you can make those adjustments on your own. Eventually, I'm going to redo the whole pattern and have a video to go through the process of how to make the leather hat and the wool hat, but that won't be for a while. So I've got some questions on how I get the leather hats to look nice with the top stitching and all that. So there's a few tricks that I use. They're not necessary, but they're helpful. One is using an iron-on interfacing on the leather so that it doesn't stretch. So you can use a woven or a non-woven light to medium weight iron-on interfacing. And so this piece doesn't have any iron-on it. This piece does, so it bonds to the back of the fabric or the back of the leather and prevents it from stretching as you're sewing. It also gives the leather a little bit more body, so it's less floppy and it will hold its shape better once it's sewn into a hat. So this piece also doesn't have any interfacing on it, and you can see how kind of floppy and flexible it is compared to this piece that has the interfacing on. It's less flexible, so it will hold its shape better as the shell of a hat. You do want to go with a leather that's more on the thin side. I think this is like 2 to 3 ounces is the weight of the leather. If it's thicker, you'll have a much harder time with top stitching. So to do the iron-on interfacing, I just cut it out roughly the size of the pattern pieces, iron it on, and then trim the edges off. Also, leather is a lot less sensitive to heat than the leather on a pelt with fur on it. If you've ever tried to do any ironing on a fur pelt and you scorch it with an iron that's too warm, it shrivels up. Buckskin doesn't tend to do that. You can get away with a medium-high heat on the iron, and just don't leave it sitting for too long in one spot. Another thing that's really helpful when sewing anything leather hats in particular, is this double-sided sticky tape that's intended for use with sewing leather. It comes in a roll like this. I get it from wowak.com, and I put it close to the edge in the seam allowance, and then line up the other pattern piece. It's hard to do with one hand, but you get the idea. Press it down so it sticks together nice and firmly, and then that acts as my pins or clips to hold those pieces together so that they're not shifting or stretching or moving out of place as I'm sewing. So that's really handy. I try to put it really close to the edge, and then I'm sewing a 1/4 inch or so from the edge so that my needle's not going through the sticky tape over and over, because I have found that it tends to gum up the needle, which can then lead to skip stitches and some other things that are frustrating. But that's just a nice alternative to using clips when you're sewing leather. And then after I sew that seam, because I'm going to top stitch down the seam allowance, I remove the tape before I do the top stitching. So now that this is sewn, I'm going to remove the double-sided tape out of the seam, because the next thing that I need to do is open up the seam and get the seam allowance to lay as flat as I can on either side. If this was fabric, I would use the iron and iron the seam flat, but leather doesn't really hold a crease in iron very well, so I'm not going to do that. I just use my fingers to press it as flat as I can to work on making that a little bit creased where the seam is. You can use that same sticky tape or some glue to glue down the seam allowance on either side to hold it down while you're sewing. That definitely makes it easier if you're new to top stitching. I don't glue it down because I just kind of work with it as I'm sewing to make sure it's laying flat. So I'm going to top stitch this now, and when I say top stitch, I mean I'm going to sew from the top side. The top of the material, in this case leather, is going to be facing up. And the reason for that is because when you're sewing, the top side of the thread always looks nicer than the underside, and that's just because of how the top thread and the bobbin thread interact. The top of your stitching always looks nicer than the underside, so that's why top stitching is done from the top side of the fabric. And there's a couple reasons for doing it. One is decorative. It looks really nice. The other is that it flattens out the seam more. You can see how this curves in, and that seam wants to bubble in like that, because that's how it behaves. It wants to be, basically wants to make a straight line and be flat. So when I top stitch, my goal is to sew the seam allowance down first on one side and then on the other side so that it's laying flat on both sides. The other thing that it does, which you'll see a little bit more after it's done, is it provides some structure to that seam so it's less likely to want to bend and collapse inward like that. So as you're sewing, the slower you can sew, the more accurate you can be. The key for me, at least, to keeping a straight line, straight top stitching, is to never watch the needle, because if you're only looking at the needle, you're going to lose track of what's going on with your material. Pick a landmark on the fabric or the material and on your presser foot that you can follow. So in this case, the seam here, I'm keeping aligned with the inner edge of this foot of my sewing machine. So as I'm sewing along, I'm making little corrections to keep the seam lined up with that foot to keep my seam straight. And as I go, because I don't have the seam allowance glued in here, I'm pausing every now and then to put my hands under the leather and make sure that that seam allowance is laying down flat and it doesn't end up curling over and the stitching goes off of the seam allowance. I'm also using my fingers to keep a little bit of tension on the leather so that it's laying nice and flat against that seam allowance and not bubbling up. So there we are. Seam allowance is half sewn. You can see how much flatter this side is compared to this side. And so that I can continue to use my same landmark, I'm going to turn this around. So now, first one I sewed top to bottom. Second side, I'm going to sew bottom to top. Okay, so now there's both sides done. You can see how much more the seam is supported now. It doesn't want to collapse in on itself as much, and that's because these are sewn down, adding support, almost like boning in a corset to keep that shape. And because I went slow and I was looking at my landmarks the whole time, it's really pretty straight. It's not going to be perfect, especially if you're just learning how to do it. You're not a machine. But the thing that lets me sew so slowly is a speed reducer pulley that's installed between the machine and the servo motor. If you've used a sewing machine with a servo motor before, you can turn down the speed of the motor, but you still have trouble going slow because it's kind of like slow, 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 fast. So the speed reducer pulley adds an extra pulley to reduce the gears, something like that, so that you can sew just at a super crawl, and then it also increases the torque. So this I ordered from Toledo Sewing Machines. They have them listed online, but you have to call to order. Definitely worth it, especially if you're doing detailed sewing. And I also just ordered a different style of speed reducer from them to try and install on my Texo 202 to hopefully have the same effect with that one, which will make it a lot easier for people to learn how to use in the classes and stuff. So now I'm going to do the same thing to attach these side pieces. going to use the sticky tape to sew these two pieces together, and then I'm going to open it up and top stitch both sides, and then I'll do the same thing with this other side. So now I'm working on a leather bomber hat style. I have a previous video where I talk about the alterations I did to the full fur bomber hat pattern so that I can use it for leather. In this top stitching, I do different from the trapper hat style. Eventually, I'll do the same double top stitching along the top, but not until I attach the ear flaps. I just attached one of the side panels, and I'm only going to do one row of top stitching instead of two. I'm going to do that along the top, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is that is going to support the top shape of the hat so that we get that nice domed look on top, so that it doesn't want to just collapse down flat. So when this is right side out, because it's a curve, the inside diameter is smaller than the outside diameter. So if you look, if I tried to fold this down and top stitch it, I end up getting a lot of wrinkles in the leather, which if I was sewing with fabric, the way to alleviate that would be to cut out little notches or V-shapes so that the leather doesn't bunch up. It would have space to lay flat. I don't really like doing that with leather because I found when I do that, you can see it a little bit on the outside of the hat. So what I'm going to do is fold the seam allowance upward and top stitch just along the top of the curve. But before I do that, I'm going to trim this top seam allowance down to pretty much nothing so that I can fold up this seam allowance and then only be sewing through 2 layers of leather, which would be this seam allowance here and this layer. So I'll get that trimmed and then show you what it looks like. So now I've trimmed away the seam allowance. So I'm going to push this up like that and then top stitch from the right side of the hat. So on the inside it currently looks like this, and then I'm going to sew that down. So now that's top stitched. That's what it looks like from the inside. That's the row of top stitching. You can see how it just supports that top and makes that really pop out. Now I will do the same thing for the other side. So now both of those sides are sewn on and then top stitched, and I will do the ear flaps next. Okay, so we're on to the next step with the hat. I sewed the earpieces together down this back seam first, and then I sewed them to the top of the hat, and there's a seam allowance inside. So I'm going to use my fingers to press the seam allowance down towards the bottom of the flap, like that, before I top stitch it. But first, I'm going to trim away this bottom piece of seam allowance. So I just trimmed down that seam allowance. When you do that, you have to make sure you don't cut any of the stitching. So I'm going to fold that down and top stitch along the top edge of the ear flap all the way around. And one of the reasons why I don't fold the seam allowance up is because then it makes this part kind of weird. It folds that up too. So I'm just going to do that one row of top stitching down there. So now that top stitching is done, And I'm going to go back and top stitch the center seam allowance down. And I'm going to do 2 rows of top stitching, one at a time. I'm going to fold the seam allowance open like this. There we go. All the top stitching and seaming is done for the leather part. That's what it looks like inside. Okay, so where we left off in the last video, I attached the leather for the back part of the forehead flap to the rest of the hat. You can use a fur sewing machine to do that. I just used my straight stitch machine because I was already using it. And then I sewed the fur onto the lining, and then the same way I do it in the full fur bomber hat tutorial on YouTube. I'm just going to take the lining, and that goes right sides together with the shell of the hat, and then I sew around the whole thing on the fur sewing machine. So I used the fur sewing machine to sew together the lining and the leather shell. So now I'll just get it flipped right side out, and then it's almost done.